All right, so we're going to talk about bone formation. And the first way that bones form are through a process called intramembranous ossification. Intramembranous ossification. So ossification just means formation of bone, okay? In intramembranous ossification, we're looking at the formation of flat bones only. So flat bones means cranial bones and the clavicle. Okay? So in order for a bone to form, it has to form from some kind of precursor. So some precursor type of tissue. And that would be a connective tissue. So bones must start with a connective tissue precursor. And in intramembranous ossification, that precursor is going to be dense, irregular connective tissue. So intramembranous ossification starts with a fibrous membrane of dense, irregular connective tissue. So once that fibrous membrane is there, so membrane, membranous, so intramembranous ossification going on here. So once we get the fibrous membrane, then we have mesenchymal cells within that membrane that will differentiate into osteoblasts, which makes sense. We're forming bone. We need bone stuff. We need bone matrix. And these mesenchymal cells that turn into osteoblast form not just an ossification center, but a primary ossification center. So, we have this tissue, this dense irregular connective tissue, and these cells become osteoblasts. So I'm not sure the best way to draw this, but so let's say we have this area of dense irregular connective tissue. So dense irregular connective tissue. So there are mesenchymal cells in here, and those mesenchymal cells then will turn into osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts start secreting. They secrete matrix. And within this dense irregular connective tissue, there are blood cells. So there's blood vessels and things running through here. Okay, so it's making this, or secreting this matrix within this primary ossification center. So this right here, where these new cells are forming and secreting matrix, is the primary ossification center. And those cells are secreting the matrix kind of around these blood vessels, and that matrix hardens and they're kind of become stuck there in their little lacunae in there as it's making bone. And this bone that it's making initially is spongy bone. All right. And so as it's making the spongy bone, it's kind of pushing the dense irregular connective tissue out and depositing here the bone tissue. So it keeps doing that until when it gets to the periphery, it starts to compress and we get compact bone. Okay, so it's going this way, and we're getting compact bone on the periphery there. What's left of this dense irregular connective tissue here is going to end up being, put the bone here and bone here, kind of like a sandwich, like that. Then this dense irregular connective tissue that's left there becomes the periosteum. Outside. So this would be the periosteum. And then we have compact bone on the the periphery. And then spongy bone with marrow in here. So those blood vessels are what the marrow then ends up being. So we have this kind of spongy bone, which is spiculed bone, all inside here, and laced through that are these vessels and blood. And that makes a flat bone, because a flat bone is kind of like a sandwich. It's kind of like two areas of compact bone, and then we've got the spongy bone inside, and the outside of it is periosteum, which is dense irregular connective tissue. And then, of course, marrow is in here as well. Okay, so that's what ossification is through the membrane. So this is called a membrane bone because it comes from a fibrous membrane. So remember, it starts with a primary ossification center, which is mesenchymal cells in a dense connective tissue, and it's irregular connective tissue, fibrous tissue. Those mesenchymal cells become osteoblasts. So they differentiate into osteoblasts, and then they start secreting matrix. And there's all this blood here because this is a connective tissue. There's dense irregular connective tissue is vascular. So it starts secreting all this bone tissue, this spongy bone tissue around this blood. And then as we get to the periphery, then it starts to consolidate, get squished up there, and we get compact bone on the edges. Okay, so these little plates of compact bone. All right, in the cranial bones, the spongy bone that is in cranial bones spongy bone is called diplo. And it doesn't mean it's anything different. It's just for whatever reason in cranial bones, it has that special name called diplo. So this would be diplo right here. Okay. So that's how we get membrane bone. So the next video we'll talk about the rest of the bones.